Okay, right. So hello again. Obviously, you would have seen a few of our water cooler conversations before. To this week, we're actually joined by a guest, our first outside guest on these water cooler moments, of Clare Emery, who's a partner at Harrison Clark Rickaby's, which is a specialist specialist law firm who do a lot of dental work, who we work with on probably upwards of 60 to 70 transactions at any given time. Clare, is that probably fair to say?
Probably about right. Yeah.
So we're still on Zoom, so we're still not in the office for obviously lockdown reasons. And you would have seen that last week we did a discussion around how the budget could potentially impact dental deals, and moreover how those deals could mean that sellers get less of the proceeds if tax was to change. So we thought it was worth having a conversation with Clare about if there are any sort of legal workarounds from that, and also if there are, is there sort of any timing or planning that you might need to go involved, because whilst, as we said last week, we think it's probably fair to say that you may have missed the boat if you haven't already agreed a deal and started the legal process with regard to the incoming budget on March 3rd. We think it's potentially more likely that there may be changes in the autumn, and now is probably the right kind of time to think about those kind of changes. I mean, would you say that that's fair, Clare? I mean, how long would you tend to budget for a typical dental transaction?
That's probably right. Dental transactions have historically taken between about 6 and 9 months to complete. A lot will depend upon if they're NHS or private, and if they're run through a limited company or through a partnership, because with dental deals, the delay is often down to the need to get a new registration with the Care Quality Commission. And in usual times, that has taken 3.5 to 4 months. And I think now it's taking, I think it's right to say, between 5 to 6 months to complete that registration process.
Yeah, I think the CQC quoted us last week as 14 weeks to get assigned an inspector. So that's without their validation time and then the time at the other end of the CQC registration process as well. So given we're recording this at middle of January, and we think that statement may come sort of late September, there isn't really much breathing space from where we are now, is there?
No, I think that's fair. I think that if you're looking at completing September or October, which is when it's most likely that we'll see the autumn statement, then you really need to be cracking on with the sales process right now, if that's your aim.
And is the CQC one of the biggest holdups that you tend to find in a deal?
Yes, they are, because the things that tend to hold deals up are the things that the parties can't control. So the CQC have their own internal processes and timings. If you have an NHS contract and a partnership, even once the CQC is sorted out, you still need to give a month's notice. And then the other things that tend to be factors can be if you have a third-party landlord, how engaged and committed they are, and also anything that you need to do to get your bank comfortable with the transaction.
Okay, but we've had it touted before that maybe you could just do an early exchange. So potentially you could exchange subject to all these things, and would that solve the problem?
Unfortunately, it wouldn't. In terms of crystallising your liability for capital gains tax, you can only do that if you exchange unconditionally. So very occasionally, you'll have a situation where a client will have completed everything that needs to be done, and they would just like to have a couple of weeks between exchange and completion to manage some internal processes, let their staff know and the like. But most dental deals are conditional, and what that means is that not all of the boxes have been ticked by the time you exchange and have to be dealt with between exchange and completion. Usually it will be the NHS, because most practitioners will not want to tell the NHS that they're selling the business until they have an exchange contract. And once you have a condition, then you don't have an unconditional exchange, and that means that the capital gains tax liability doesn't bite.
Okay.
Sorry.
So Karen, Paul, sorry.
And an unconditional exchange is obviously, if you got to the point of an unconditional exchange, it's still a big risk from the buyer's point of view.
It's probably less of a risk from the buyer's point of view, in the sense that usually if you get to an unconditional exchange, you've done everything that you would ordinarily do other than complete. And so in that sense, they should be okay at that point. All of their boxes with their bank, the landlord and so on should have been ticked off. The issue from a buyer's point of view is if you're looking to an unconditional exchange when not all of those things have been done, and then it would be a big risk to them, because they'd have to complete at a given moment in time, even if the landlord wasn't happy or the bank wasn't happy or the NHS wasn't satisfied.
Because that's one of the ways, isn't it, that some dental lawyers, I'm not sure whether it includes yourself or not, have been sort of saying this could be a potential workaround, would be to unconditionally exchange on, say, the 2nd of March, as we're talking about this budget, but with a long stop date for completion, say, much later in the year of October, November time, because then you've got lots of time for those things to catch up, even though if you've unconditionally exchanged. Is that, would you say, a fair workaround? Or?
It is a workaround that works, but I think it's difficult to see why a buyer would want to do it. I think it does place, as Paul was saying earlier on, quite a lot of risk on the buyer, because they are relying on the fact that the business that they agreed to buy in March is still the same business when they come to buy it in September. Things could have changed. We know from 2020 that lots of things can change in 6 months. That's definitely what last year showed us. But also, what happens to the buyer if the landlord won't agree to transfer the lease at that point, or the bank won't agree to lend the money? They've committed to an unconditional contract, and they have to buy the practice or be in breach of contract when that time period expires. So it's hard to see why a buyer would want to do that.
And the penalty can be quite severe in terms of financial impact. If they weren't then to follow through completion, is the actual financial impact on them can be quite great.
Yes, I mean, if you've agreed to buy, I was speaking to somebody this morning who's looking to buy a practice for £1.3 million. Now, fortunately, they don't want to complete until October, so they've got heaps of time. But if they wanted to exchange now, they need to know that they will be in a position in October not only to have that £1.3 million, but also to take a chance on the fact that they still want to buy the practice at that point, when they may not have investigated it fully. And even if they have, lots of things may change between now and then.
And what about a side letter? Because I did a couple last year with a side letter. Is that an effective workaround?
It's not something that I would personally feel comfortable recommending. I think the issue with a side letter is that you are entering into a document that slightly defeats the point of the main document that you've entered into. And so if you enter into that document and there were any tax investigation, you ought to disclose that properly to HMRC, because otherwise you could be seen to be evading tax. And it sounds a little bit po-faced, but that's probably not a document that I would want to assist somebody in entering into, I don't think.
Okay. Any other ideas? Anything else out there?
If you're selling a company where your CQC is in place and you're selling a freehold and you've done your searches and it's a private practice, that probably can be done if everybody puts their pedal to the metal, because you aren't relying on any third parties in quite the same way as you are when you have the NHS, the CQC and landlords. Those deals are probably still just about doable. We've looked at whether you could complete on £1 now and have the rest of it deferred. Technically, if you look at the wording at HMRC, that works. But I think, speaking to a few accountants in the sector, that again, they don't feel entirely comfortable that were that to be properly investigated by HMRC, they would look at whether there was a good commercial reason other than trying to crystallise your tax liability for doing the deal in that way. And it may be that they would conclude that there wasn't. So it is going to be really difficult for most people now to hit that deadline unless they're pretty well advanced on their transactions. Fine.
So really, March the 3rd, the ship has sailed. But if you think it's coming in the autumn, now is really the time to be thinking about it.
Yeah, and that's what I'm telling my new inquiries now, and I've probably lost a couple of deals because of it. But the reality is, I think where we are now post-Christmas, that ship is, it's pretty well sailed.
Okay.
Having said all of that, as I say, there is still plenty of time to get deals done for the autumn. And it may be that if the, given the general background at the moment, that the Chancellor may decide to push out any substantive changes to capital gains tax into the long grass, at least for 6 months.
No, good. Well, thanks, Claire. I know we're kind of short on time, but obviously if anyone can find you, their contact details will be on here anyway. So any more questions, then yeah, I'm sure people get in touch. But that's great. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Yes,
well, really
great.
nice to speak to you both.
Yeah.